The future of Alberta's oil patch has been widely discussed this week after Teck Resources decided to bail on its multi-billion-dollar oil sands mine. Conservatives blame the federal Liberals, arguing they've created a climate that scares away energy investment. On our program this week, Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan insisted the opposite is true.
We, though, have a deep and abiding sense of how important this industry is to the national economy. And we also have an understanding of how, the investment climate around the world is changing. How do you bring those two together? We are committed to net zero. What we're finding is that a marker for the international investment community, increasingly on whether or not you are taking climate change seriously in the decisions that you're making, is net zero.
Although, as Minister O'Regan said, the feds have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, they have not yet released their plan to get there. So, what have other countries done? John Merton is the UK's envoy to COP26, the UN's climate change conference. He joins us now here in studio. Hi, Mr. Merton. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Welcome. I appreciate it. Can you help us understand from the UK's perspective what net zero means and how your country has sort of legislated the idea?
Thanks. Net zero is bringing into balance your greenhouse gas emissions with any sinks that you make through planting new trees or carbon capture and storage, so that you have no net impact upon the environment. And we passed a law in the UK Parliament last June to make that a UK legal requirement that we hit net zero on or before 2050.
And what is the sort of genesis behind it? Why is this the idea that Parliament has sort of attached itself to?
So the Paris Agreement that Canada is also a party to made clear that we are all agreed that we need to work together to try and limit climate change to 2 degrees of warming, or make as much progress as possible to 1.5 degrees of warming. And the science very clearly tells us that to achieve that goal, we need to bring our emissions and sinks into balance in the second half of the 20th century. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change makes clear that industrialized economies need to go first in that regard under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And so we think if we're going to ask others to make that net zero delivery in the second half of the 21st century, we need to do it first. So we've legislated that we'll do it by 2050.
So the conversation is taking place in this country as well because it became a campaign pledge of the party that ended up winning the election, albeit with a lessened majority, with a minority. And the one question that we continually have right now is, okay, what does that mean? It's a goal here, but we don't have details about yet about how the government plans to achieve it. We're told they're coming soon. How is the UK going to go about trying to achieve that goal? What are some tangible examples you can share with our audience?
So I'll give you a very clear example. We know we have to get to net zero by 2050. That means we need to reduce our emissions from road transport almost to zero by 2050. So we had previously pledged that we would phase out the sale of petrol, diesel and hybrid vehicles by 2040. We've now brought that forward to 2035 because the average life of a vehicle in the UK is between 8 and 12 years, which means if you're still selling them in 2040, they're still going to be on the road in 2050. So we've brought that date forward to 2035. And what we found is the net zero target is really helpful for the government in terms of thinking through how it will achieve emissions reductions at a low cost. Because by having a long-term target, it enables financial decision makers to make their resource allocations in a rational fashion and avoid investing in assets that become stranded and worthless.
So let me ask you with that example. How do you then encourage or make, let's say, electric vehicles, more affordable? Or is it an investment in more public transport? Like, how do you counterbalance the decision that you've made to phase those out?
So the system that's currently in place is a system of carbon emission averages per vehicle sold by a manufacturer. And what we're saying is the level of emissions that you sell to a manufacturer must be at an average of a certain level. And we're bringing that average down every year. And if vehicle manufacturers don't sell vehicles that match those standards, they will pay large fines. And what they're having to do is now, for every SUV, for example, they sell, they will need to be selling zero-emission vehicles to bring that average down to the level that we've stipulated, and we'll gradually reduce those levels.
And I know there are other sort of decisions being made in light of this pledge. For example, I think the latest one I read is about a third runway.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
So the third runway is slightly separate. That was a court decision that we've just seen yesterday, I think, in the UK. Yes. Forgive me, time difference. So that's a slightly separate set of issues. But it's clear that all of our policy making needs to be set around net zero and how we achieve that. So that means, as we set our energy policy, for example, we wouldn't think to invest in coal power anymore, because if you build a coal power station with a life of 40 years, you're still going to be producing gases in 2050. And what we're seeing is the financial sector, the investors really reacting to that goal and no longer wanting to finance things in polluting sectors because they know that essentially that can be a future financial liability for them.
Is there any accountability built into this? So we have this discussion again here very often because there are targets that have been set through COP in Paris, for example, that right now we're not on track to meet. But there's no real, I mean, we've had successive governments that have yet to meet their climate targets. Is there any accountability built into what you're proposing?
We have first of all, we have a bipartisan political support that this is a good thing to do. And the only doubt we had before our election in December was the government going to be remaining committed to a 2050 net zero, or were they wanting to bring it forward? So we have that political support, and we have our independent committee on climate change, which reports to Parliament and gives them independent advice on whether the government is meeting its targets and what the targets, what we should be striving to achieve to help deliver on the science. So
help me understand how there is able to be a lack of partisanship on this issue, because we are not at that stage in this country. It's a very, very divisive and divided along partisan lines kind of debate.
Yep. I think the turning point for us was something called the Stern Report back in 2006, I think it was, which was a report that basically showed that the costs of dealing with climate change through increased flooding or lack of rainfall or whatever the impacts of climate change would be on agriculture and elsewhere, the cost of dealing with climate change were going to be much more than the cost of trying to prevent it by reducing our emissions. And it's been described that the emissions of greenhouse gases are the biggest market failure of all time. And so we very much view the perspective that this is good for our economy. And the UK has grown faster than the average of G7 member states over the last 30 years. But at the same time, whilst G7 member states' average of emissions per capita has remained broadly the same, the UK has reduced ours by 43%. So we've grown faster than the G7 average whilst reducing our emissions. And we think that shows that you can decouple the two.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is that at all because of the basis of the economy? Like the UK's economy, its geography, its resource sector, for example, is very different than Canada's. Does that have anything to do with it?
Well, that plays a part, and that's undeniable, but it doesn't account for it all. And what we've seen over the last 20 years in the UK is huge investment in renewables, and they're coming down on a really sharp cost curve. So the phone I've got in my pocket is cheaper and more powerful than anything the Pentagon had 30 years ago. And what we're seeing is a similar cost reductions coming in with things like wind and solar. So 4 years ago, if I give you an example, we did an auction for offshore wind. The price came in at £91, which is about 150 Canadian dollars per megawatt hour. 4 years later, it was down to 37, and we're seeing those costs continue. And that 37 is cheaper than gas in the UK. We're already seeing, if I go to the United Arab Emirates, I'm seeing them deliver solar at $17 a megawatt hour. So the question is not can you afford to invest in renewables, but can you afford not to? Because if you're laden with expensive energy, if you go to Japan, for example, they're paying about $90 a megawatt hour wholesale for their electricity. How will they compete with industry from the UAE or India, where they've got plans to put in 450 gigawatts of solar? How will they compete with people who are investing in solar that is now much cheaper than coal or gas?
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.